The most dangerous form of ignorance is not stupidity. It is intelligence that has fallen in love with its own reflection. That sounds backwards. After all, we spend our entire lives believing that knowledge protects us, that education protects us, that intelligence acts like a shield against manipulation, bad decisions, and self-destruction. But what if the opposite is sometimes true? What if the sharper the mind becomes, the more sophisticated its illusions can become as well? This is the unsettling question hidden inside one of the most mysterious archetypes in Journey to the West, the Six-Eared Macaque. Not as a character. Not as a creature. Not as a piece of mythology. But as a psychological pattern. A symbolic force. A mirror. And perhaps that mirror is far closer to us than we would like to admit. Because throughout history, some of the most catastrophic mistakes were not made by fools. They were made by brilliant people. Intelligent leaders. Talented thinkers. Visionaries who convinced themselves that they were seeing reality clearly while unknowingly becoming trapped inside stories of their own creation. Why does that happen? Why can a highly intelligent person recognize deception everywhere except within themselves? And why does the human mind seem uniquely capable of building prisons that feel like freedom? This is where the archetype of the six-eared macaque becomes disturbing. At the surface level, it appears to represent imitation. A copy. A duplicate. Something false pretending to be real. But the deeper symbolic question is far more uncomfortable. What happens when the copy no longer knows it is a copy? What happens when illusion becomes indistinguishable from identity? Think about that for a moment. Imagine standing in front of a perfect mirror. A mirror so flawless that it reflects every detail with absolute precision. Every movement. Every expression. Every certainty. Now imagine that this mirror reflects everything except the truth. That is our first memory fragment. A perfect mirror that reflects everything except truth. And suddenly the problem is no longer deception by others. The problem becomes deception by ourselves. This is not merely a spiritual question. It is a human question. In modern life, we constantly construct identities. We build personal brands, political identities, professional identities, social identities. We curate images of who we are and what we believe. And the longer we inhabit those identities, the harder it becomes to separate reality from the story we tell ourselves. The contradiction is striking. The more intelligent a person becomes, the more tools they possess to defend their existing beliefs. Not necessarily because they are correct, but because they are attached. And attachment has a strange relationship with intelligence. Intelligence seeks explanations. Attachment seeks protection. When the two join forces, self-deception becomes extraordinarily difficult to detect. This is where the symbolic warning becomes larger than any individual person. What begins as a psychological problem can expand into a cultural problem. A society can become attached to an identity. A movement can become attached to a narrative. An institution can become attached to an illusion. And when that happens, intelligence does not always dismantle the illusion. Sometimes it strengthens it. Sometimes it builds an entire palace around it. That is our second memory fragment. A traveler lost inside a maze built from his own intelligence. Not trapped by walls. Trapped by explanations. Trapped by certainty. Trapped by the belief that he cannot possibly be lost. And perhaps that is why this archetype continues to matter today. Because the greatest threat is not ignorance. Ignorance can learn. Ignorance can ask questions. Ignorance can change. The greater threat is certainty. The moment a person becomes incapable of questioning the stories their own mind produces. That is where the symbolism begins to move beyond psychology and into spiritual territory. Because many wisdom traditions share a similar warning, the greatest obstacle to truth is not lack of knowledge. It is attachment to a false sense of knowing. And that leads us to our third memory fragment. A shadow standing so close to the body that nobody can tell them apart. including the person casting the shadow. But here is the mystery that changes everything. If illusion can become intelligent, if self-deception can wear the mask of wisdom, if a false identity can become indistinguishable from an authentic one, then how can anyone know whether they are pursuing truth or simply becoming more skilled at defending an illusion? If the mind can defend an illusion so convincingly, then we have to ask a more uncomfortable question. Why does it want to? Not why people make mistakes. Not why people become confused. Those are ordinary human experiences. The deeper mystery is why human beings become emotionally invested in identities that no longer serve them. Because once we move beyond intelligence, we encounter something far more powerful. Attachment. And this is where the symbolic role of the six-eared macaque begins to expand beyond psychology and into spiritual territory. Most people assume attachment means attachment to money, status, possessions, or relationships. But Buddhist philosophy repeatedly points toward a more subtle form of attachment. Attachment to the self. Attachment to the story of who we think we are. Attachment to certainty. Attachment to being right. And that changes everything. Because if the false self were obviously false, nobody would believe it. Its power comes from resemblance. Its power comes from familiarity. Its power comes from speaking in a voice that sounds exactly like our own. That is the contradiction. Human beings fear external manipulation, yet most manipulation becomes effective only after it has been internalized. The most persuasive voice is often not outside us. It is the voice inside us that already agrees with what we want to believe. Think about modern life. A person builds an identity around success. Another builds one around political beliefs. Another around intelligence. Another around victimhood. Another around being a good person. At first these identities feel useful. Then they become necessary. Eventually they become sacred. And once something becomes sacred, questioning it begins to feel like a threat. Not to the belief. To the self. This is where the archetype reveals something deeply unsettling. The false self does not usually appear as a villain. It appears as a protector. It promises safety. It promises certainty. It promises consistency. Yet those promises come with a hidden cost. The cost is growth. Because growth requires uncertainty. Growth requires self-examination. Growth requires the willingness to discover that yesterday's certainty may become today's illusion. That is why so many people remain trapped inside psychological structures they no longer recognize. Not because they are weak. Not because they are unintelligent. But because they have confused identity with truth. And when identity and truth become fused together, every challenge begins to feel personal. Every disagreement feels threatening. Every contradiction feels dangerous. Every new piece of evidence feels like an attack. That is our next memory fragment. A counterfeit crown worn so long that nobody remembers the real king. The crown is not the problem. The forgetting is. The moment we forget that identity is a tool rather than a truth, we begin serving the mask instead of reality. Notice how this pattern scales. What begins inside one mind can spread into families, communities, institutions, entire societies. A single illusion can become a collective identity. And once enough people share the same illusion, it gains something dangerous. Legitimacy. Suddenly falsehood no longer feels false. It feels normal. It feels obvious. It feels unquestionable. History is filled with examples of intelligent people defending ideas that later generations could clearly see were flawed. Yet the truly fascinating question is not why they were wrong. The fascinating question is why they could not see it. Why did intelligence fail to save them? Perhaps because intelligence was never designed to reveal truth by itself. Perhaps intelligence is a tool. And like any tool, its value depends on the hand that wields it. A brilliant mind driven by humility may move toward wisdom. A brilliant mind driven by attachment may move deeper into illusion. The difference is not intellectual capacity. The difference is awareness. And this is where the symbolic meaning becomes even more mysterious. What if the real danger is not believing a lie? What if the real danger is becoming psychologically dependent on that lie? Because once dependency appears, illusion gains roots. And roots are much harder to remove than ideas. That brings us to another memory fragment. A locked gate whose key was always in the prisoner's hand. The prison was never built from ignorance. It was built from attachment. But if attachment creates the prison, then what exactly keeps the door locked? And more importantly, why do so many people refuse to leave even after discovering the key? But what if the door remains locked because the prisoner does not actually want freedom? That possibility sounds absurd at first. Most people would immediately reject it. We tell ourselves that every human being wants truth. That everyone wants clarity. That if illusion disappeared tomorrow, we would gladly embrace reality. Yet human behavior suggests something far more complicated. Because there are moments when people do not resist truth because they cannot see it. They resist truth because it threatens something they love. Not money. Not power. Not status. Identity. And this is where the deepest contradiction begins to emerge. The archetype we are exploring is not simply connected to deception. It is connected to preservation. The preservation of a self-image. The preservation of an internal story. The preservation of a psychological structure that allows a person to remain coherent in their own eyes. Why does this matter? Because once identity becomes the highest priority, truth is quietly demoted. Not rejected. Not denied. Simply placed second. And the consequences become profound. A person can spend decades defending an image rather than examining reality. An organization can spend generations protecting a narrative rather than confronting facts. A civilization can spend centuries worshipping assumptions it no longer understands. Notice the escalation. We are no longer discussing individual mistakes. We are discussing systems of perception. Entire structures of thought. Entire realities constructed from unquestioned assumptions. This is where the symbolic function of the shadow becomes crucial. Most people imagine a shadow as something dark, hidden, or evil. But psychologically, the shadow is often much more subtle. It is the part of ourselves we refuse to recognize. The possibility we do not want to consider. The truth that threatens the story. And here is the revelation. The more strongly a person identifies with an image of themselves, the larger the shadow becomes. Not because they become worse. Because they become less visible to themselves. That is the paradox. Self-knowledge and self-image are not the same thing. In fact, they often move in opposite directions. The stronger the image becomes, the weaker the awareness becomes. The stronger the certainty becomes, the less room remains for discovery. That is why many spiritual traditions place such enormous emphasis on humility. Not because humility is morally superior, but because humility creates space. Space for uncertainty. Space for contradiction. Space for reality to enter. Without that space, the mind becomes sealed. A closed system. And every closed system eventually begins feeding on itself. Consider another memory fragment. A lighthouse whose light no longer points toward the ocean. It points back toward itself. At first, it still appears functional. It still shines. It still looks impressive. But it has lost its purpose. The same thing can happen to intelligence. Intelligence can stop seeking truth and begin seeking confirmation. It can stop exploring and begin defending. It can stop questioning and begin protecting. When that transformation occurs, brilliance becomes circular. And circular thinking creates something extremely dangerous. The illusion of progress. A person feels they are moving forward while traveling in circles. A society feels it is advancing while repeating the same mistakes. A civilization feels enlightened while becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. This pattern appears everywhere in modern life. Information increases. Certainty increases. Conflict increases. Yet understanding does not always increase alongside them. Why? Because information and wisdom are not the same thing. Knowledge and insight are not the same thing. And perhaps the most uncomfortable possibility of all is that awareness cannot be accumulated. Like information, it requires something information alone cannot provide. Transformation. This brings us to another memory fragment. A library filled with books that nobody truly reads. Not because the words are hidden. Because the reader believes they already know what the words mean. And suddenly the central conflict takes on a different shape. The greatest obstacle may not be ignorance. The greatest obstacle may be premature certainty. The moment we stop investigating ourselves. The moment we assume the journey is complete. The moment we become convinced that our current perspective is the final one. That is when growth quietly ends. And yet an even deeper contradiction remains. If attachment creates illusion, and certainty protects attachment, then what creates certainty in the first place? What is the original force that convinces human beings to cling so tightly to identities, beliefs, and self-images that they become willing to sacrifice reality itself in order to preserve them? Perhaps the answer lies beneath identity altogether. Perhaps the shadow is not protecting the self. Perhaps it is protecting something even older. Something far more fundamental. Something that most people spend their entire lives trying not to see. What is that deeper force that the shadow is protecting? The answer begins to appear when we stop looking at identity as the problem and start looking at what identity is trying to conceal. Because beneath every attachment, beneath every certainty, beneath every carefully constructed self-image, there is often a much older human experience. Vulnerability. This is the revelation that changes the entire landscape. The symbolic function of the six-eared macaque is not merely to represent deception. It represents a defensive structure built around a fear that has not been fully understood. The fear of uncertainty. The fear of insignificance. The fear of not knowing who we are. And perhaps most importantly, the fear of confronting reality without psychological armor. This is why the archetype is so powerful. It reveals that illusion is not always created because people love falsehood. Sometimes illusion is created because people fear exposure. Not exposure to others. Exposure to themselves. That distinction matters. Because once we recognize this, the role of the shadow changes completely. The shadow is no longer simply an enemy. It becomes a messenger. A signal. A symptom. A symbolic indicator pointing toward an unresolved fear buried beneath awareness. This is where the spiritual dimension becomes much deeper than psychology alone. Many people assume wisdom means acquiring better answers. Yet Buddhist philosophy repeatedly points in a different direction. Wisdom is often the gradual removal of false certainty. Not the accumulation of conclusions, but the dismantling of illusions. That process sounds beautiful in theory. In reality, it is profoundly uncomfortable. Because every illusion removed creates a temporary void. And human beings do not naturally enjoy emptiness. We rush to fill it. With beliefs. With identities. With ideologies. With explanations. With stories. Anything that allows us to avoid standing face to face with uncertainty. This creates another paradox. The false self is not maintained because it is strong. It is maintained because something beneath it feels fragile. That is our next memory fragment. A magnificent castle built on top of a sinkhole. From a distance it appears powerful. Stable. Permanent. Yet every stone is secretly supporting a structure built over emptiness. The castle is not the illusion. The refusal to examine the foundation is. And suddenly the symbolic meaning expands beyond individuals. Entire institutions can become castles. Entire belief systems can become castles. Entire civilizations can become castles. Not because they lack intelligence. Because they become afraid of questioning the assumptions beneath their own foundations. This is where the consequences become historical. When a society loses the ability to examine itself, correction becomes difficult. When correction becomes difficult, adaptation slows. When adaptation slows, fragility increases. And fragility hidden behind confidence is one of the most dangerous conditions any system can experience. The pattern appears repeatedly across human history. Not merely in politics. Not merely in religion. Not merely in culture. But in every domain where certainty becomes more important than truth. And that brings us to another symbolic layer that has remained hidden until now. The archetype is not warning us about false information. It is warning us about false identification. There is a profound difference. False information can be corrected. False identification becomes part of the self. Once that happens, evidence is no longer evaluated objectively. It becomes emotionally filtered. Accepted if it supports identity. Rejected if it threatens identity. At that moment, perception itself begins to bend. Not because reality changed. Because the observer changed. That is our next memory fragment. A pair of glasses worn for so many years that the wearer forgets they are looking through a lens. The lens becomes invisible. The distortion becomes normal. And normality becomes almost impossible to question. This may be the deepest symbolic warning hidden within the archetype. The greatest distortions are rarely recognized as distortions. They are experienced as reality. Which leads to a revelation that completely reframes the journey we have been exploring. Perhaps the central problem is not whether a person can distinguish truth from falsehood. Perhaps the deeper question is whether a person can distinguish themselves from the identities they have accumulated over a lifetime. Because if identity itself becomes the lens through which reality is interpreted, then every perception, every judgment, every certainty may already be shaped before conscious thought even begins. And if that is true, then we are forced to confront an even more unsettling possibility. What if the shadow is not standing in front of truth at all? What if the shadow is standing between us and the observer who is trying to see truth in the first place? And if the observer itself becomes distorted, who, exactly, is left to recognize the distortion? If the observer can become distorted, then we arrive at the question that sits at the very center of this entire mystery. What exactly is the observer trying to protect? Not identity. Not belief. Not certainty. Those are only symptoms. The deeper answer is attachment. And this is the core revelation hidden beneath the archetype. The six-eared macaque is not fundamentally a symbol of deception. It is a symbol of attachment masquerading as awareness. That distinction changes everything. Because attachment does not merely cling to possessions, relationships, or status. Attachment can cling to intelligence. Attachment can cling to morality. Attachment can cling to spiritual progress. Attachment can even cling to the image of being awake. This is the paradox most people miss. The closer a person moves toward wisdom, the more subtle attachment becomes. The crude attachments are easy to recognize. The sophisticated attachments are not. A person can let go of wealth and become attached to virtue. Let go of status and become attached to humility. Let go of ideology and become attached to enlightenment itself. The form changes. The mechanism remains. And that mechanism is the true symbolic function of the archetype. Not evil. Not corruption. Not ignorance. Identification. The unconscious fusion between awareness and what awareness observes. This is where the deepest layer of Buddhist philosophy enters the conversation. Suffering does not arise simply because reality is difficult. Suffering arises because the mind continuously creates structures it believes must be protected. An identity. A role. A worldview. A narrative. A version of oneself. Then it spends enormous energy defending those structures. The irony is profound. The mind creates the burden. Then suffers beneath its weight. That is our next memory fragment. A man carrying a heavy stone up a mountain for decades, never realizing he picked it up himself. The mountain is not the suffering. The stone is. And yet he calls the stone me. This is why attachment becomes so difficult to see. Because eventually the burden and the identity merge together. At that point, losing the burden feels like losing oneself. And this is precisely where transformation becomes possible. Not when a person gains more information. Not when a person wins more arguments. Not when a person accumulates more knowledge. Transformation begins when a person recognizes the difference between awareness and identity, between seeing and what is seen, between consciousness and the stories consciousness tells itself. That recognition is subtle, but its consequences are enormous. Because once awareness becomes disentangled from identity, something remarkable happens. The need for constant defense begins to weaken. The need for certainty begins to soften. The need to control every outcome begins to loosen. Not because reality becomes safer. Because the self no longer depends upon being right. And this creates one of the most important symbolic reversals in the entire archetype. What appears to be strength is often attachment. What appears to be weakness is often openness. What appears to be certainty is often fear. What appears to be surrender is often freedom. This reversal extends far beyond individual psychology. Entire institutions become attached to their narratives. Entire cultures become attached to their myths. Entire civilizations become attached to their self-images. And whenever attachment hardens into identity, adaptation becomes difficult. Reality continues changing. The identity does not. Eventually conflict emerges. Not because reality is hostile. Because attachment resists change. That is our next memory fragment. A tree that refuses to bend during a storm because it mistakes rigidity for strength. The tree believes it is preserving itself. Yet the very thing it protects becomes the source of its vulnerability. This pattern repeats everywhere. In relationships. In organizations. In political systems. In intellectual communities. In spiritual communities. The same mechanism. Different costumes. And that reveals the deepest hidden meaning of all. The archetype is not asking whether human beings can recognize illusion. It is asking whether human beings can recognize their attachment to illusion. Those are not the same challenge. One concerns perception. The other concerns desire. Because attachment survives even after illusion has been exposed. People often know. Yet they still cling. Not because the illusion is convincing. Because letting go feels frightening. Which brings us to the final memory fragment. A hand gripping a rope so tightly that it forgets the rope is what keeps it trapped. The prison is not outside. The prison is the gripping itself. And now a new consequence begins to emerge. If attachment is the hidden force behind illusion. If illusion shapes identity. And if identity shapes entire systems of thought, then the influence of this archetype extends far beyond a single mind. It begins shaping cultures, institutions, generations, perhaps even entire civilizations. And that raises a far larger question. If attachment can quietly influence the way individuals perceive reality, what happens when entire societies become attached to identities they no longer know how to question? What happens when attachment is no longer confined to individuals? What happens when entire groups, institutions, and civilizations begin gripping the rope? This is where the consequences of the archetype become impossible to ignore. Because the legacy of attachment is not merely personal suffering. Its true legacy is distortion that survives long after the original cause has been forgotten. Think about that carefully. Most people assume consequences end when a mistake is corrected. But some consequences become embedded inside systems. They become traditions, assumptions, cultural instincts, invisible operating principles passed from one generation to the next. Over time, nobody remembers why they exist. They simply become normal. This is the long shadow of attachment. And this is why the symbolic meaning extends far beyond psychology. The archetype is not warning us about a moment of confusion. It is warning us about inherited blindness. The kind of blindness that feels like common sense. The kind that becomes so familiar nobody questions it. That is our first echoing memory fragment. A pair of glasses worn for so many years that the wearer forgets they exist. The lens disappears. The distortion remains. And what begins inside one mind eventually scales upward. Families inherit narratives. Organizations inherit assumptions. Nations inherit identities. Civilizations inherit myths about themselves. Some of those myths are useful. Some are not. The danger appears when inherited stories become untouchable. Because once questioning stops, adaptation slows. And when adaptation slows, reality continues moving while perception remains frozen. This is one of the deepest patterns in human history. Not the collapse of intelligence. The collapse of self-correction. The inability to update. The inability to recognize when an old map no longer matches the territory. And here we discover another consequence that is rarely discussed. Attachment does not merely distort perception. It distorts potential. Entire futures can be sacrificed in defense of outdated identities. Individuals stay trapped in versions of themselves they outgrew years ago. Organizations continue solving problems that no longer exist. Societies repeat conflicts rooted in assumptions nobody remembers creating. The cost is not only suffering. The cost is stagnation. The cost is unrealized transformation. That is our next memory fragment. A ship anchored in a harbor long after the storm has passed. The anchor once provided safety. Now it prevents movement. Nothing about the anchor changed. Only the circumstances changed. Yet attachment struggles to recognize that difference. And this reveals something profound about human nature. Many people imagine freedom as the ability to acquire more. More knowledge. More success. More influence. More certainty. But the archetype points toward a different possibility. Perhaps freedom is the ability to release what no longer serves growth. Not because it was evil. Not because it was foolish. Because it has completed its purpose. This insight becomes even more significant when viewed at the level of civilization. Throughout history, some of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerged not when people discovered new answers, but when they abandoned old assumptions. A shift in perspective. A willingness to question. A recognition that certainty itself may be limiting perception. This is why the legacy of the archetype remains relevant in the modern world. Technology changes. Politics change. Economics change. Social platforms change. Human psychology remains remarkably consistent. The forms evolve. The mechanism survives. The same attachment that once shaped ancient identities now shapes digital identities. The same desire for certainty now operates through algorithms, communities, ideologies, and personal narratives. The same psychological forces continue influencing how people interpret reality. Different century. Same pattern. And perhaps that is the most important legacy of all. The archetype endures because it is not describing a historical problem. It is describing a recurring human condition. A pattern that reappears whenever awareness becomes subordinate to attachment. Whenever identity becomes more important than truth. Whenever certainty becomes more valuable than understanding. That is our final memory fragment for this stage of the journey. A magnificent castle built over a sinkhole. Generations live inside it. Generations defend it. Generations celebrate it. Yet very few ever ask what lies beneath its foundation. The castle survives. The question disappears. And that may be the greatest consequence of all. Not that people become trapped by illusion, but that they eventually forget they are supposed to be looking beyond it. Yet one mystery still remains unresolved. If attachment creates illusion, if illusion shapes identity, if identity influences entire civilizations, then what would a human being actually look like without those layers? What remains when the stories fall silent, the attachments loosen, and the observer is finally left alone with reality itself? And perhaps even more unsettling, would most people recognize that reality if they saw it? Perhaps that is why this archetype has survived for centuries. Not because it belongs to a particular story. Not because it belongs to a particular culture. But because it points toward something that every human being eventually encounters. The strange distance between what we are and what we believe ourselves to be. When viewed from this perspective, the deepest legacy of the archetype is not a warning about deception. It is a reminder about awareness. A reminder that the human mind possesses a remarkable ability to construct identities, meanings, explanations, and narratives. This ability has built civilizations. It has created art, philosophy, science, and culture. Yet the same ability can also create layers between ourselves and reality. And those layers are rarely obvious. They arrive disguised as certainty. They arrive disguised as understanding. They arrive disguised as the feeling that the search is over. That may be why genuine transformation often feels so quiet. Popular culture frequently imagines transformation as dramatic. A breakthrough. A victory. A moment of conquest. But the deeper spiritual tradition suggests something different. Transformation may begin with subtraction rather than addition. Not becoming something else. Not acquiring a new identity. Not constructing a better image. But gradually releasing what was never essential in the first place. Like a traveler setting down unnecessary baggage after carrying it for miles. The road does not change. The traveler changes. And suddenly the journey feels different. This is where all the memory fragments begin to echo together. The perfect mirror that reflected everything except truth. The traveler lost inside a maze built from his own intelligence. The counterfeit crown worn so long that nobody remembered the real king. The magnificent castle built over a sinkhole. The hand gripping the rope that kept it trapped. Each image appears different. Yet they all point toward the same human tendency. The tendency to mistake what is familiar for what is true. The tendency to defend what is known rather than explore what is real. The tendency to become attached not only to possessions or beliefs, but to the very structure of the self. And perhaps that is the deepest human meaning hidden within the archetype. The problem is not that people have identities. The problem is forgetting that identities are temporary. Useful. Functional. But temporary. Like clothing worn for a season. The difficulty begins when the clothing is mistaken for the person. When the role is mistaken for the actor. When the story is mistaken for the awareness capable of observing the story. From a spiritual perspective, this may explain why awakening is so often described not as discovering something new, but as seeing something that was always present. Not hidden. Simply overlooked. Buried beneath layers of identification. Buried beneath assumptions. Buried beneath attachment. And perhaps this is why the archetype continues to feel unsettling even now. Because it suggests that the greatest obstacles in life may not be external. Not circumstances. Not enemies. Not limitations. But the invisible structures through which we interpret all of those things. The lens. The filter. The unnoticed assumption. The silent attachment. Modern life has given humanity unprecedented access to information. Yet information alone does not guarantee clarity. In some ways, the challenge becomes even greater. The more voices we hear, the more stories we encounter, the more identities become available for us to adopt. And so the ancient question remains surprisingly relevant. Not who is right. Not who is wrong. But who is observing? Who is experiencing? Who is aware beneath the endless movement of thoughts, beliefs, fears, ambitions, and identities? Because if awareness is constantly fused with what it observes, then confusion becomes inevitable. But if awareness can recognize its own attachments without becoming trapped by them, something changes. Not necessarily the world. Not necessarily circumstances. But the relationship to them. And perhaps that is where wisdom truly begins. Not in certainty. Not in conclusions. Not in possessing the final answer. But in maintaining the courage to keep looking beyond the mirror. To keep questioning the castle. To keep loosening the grip on the rope. To keep walking through the maze without assuming it has already been understood. Because the most profound mystery may not be whether illusion exists. The most profound mystery may be this: if everything we call for myself can be observed, questioned, changed, or released, then what is the one thing that remains when there is nothing left to defend?